Hi, this is Mike. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I got a different kind of presentation today. We're going to talk about Major General Benjamin Butler, a significant Civil War federal general who's usually almost always portrayed as fairly incompetent. And I have a different point of view here, and got some data to back it up. So let's go ahead. First of all, why would I get interested in General Butler? Well, it's kind of interesting how I got into it. As you know, I've been modeling the City Point and Army Line Railroad in the Civil War, and I knew a lot about the City Point after the Army of the Potomac got in the area, but I didn't know much about what happened and when did City Point get captured and what happened while the Army of the James under Butler had occupied City Point. So I decided to start reading a bit about the Army of James and the Bermuda Hundred campaign, which started at the exact same time as Grant's Overland campaign. It was a multi-pronged offensive in the spring of 1864 that General Grant had engineered in order to crush the Confederacy, or at least that was the plan. And because I had this interest in City Point, I wanted to know more about what happened early on at City Point, before Grant got there, before the U.S. military railroads put the railroad in and stuff. And there's a second reason. I live near Lowell, Massachusetts, where for much of his life General Butler had his home and some of his businesses. He ran his law practice. So that's why I got interested in General Butler. So I started researching. I wasn't really particularly researching General Butler when I started this little thing. I was more researching what happened at City Point, but I got interested in General Butler. And General Butler is a very interesting character. He had a successful early war occupation of Maryland. Many of you may know about the draft riot, or not the draft riots, but the riots in Maryland when the Union armies first went through Maryland to get to Washington, D.C. to protect Washington, D.C. And Maryland was it hadn't succeeded, but it was in danger of succeeding. The governor was very pro-Confederate. And a lot of the population was. It was a slave state. And General Butler and the couple of Massachusetts regiments went through Baltimore, and the first one went through. There was a riot, and several citizens as soldiers were killed. And these troops, although Butler wasn't present, were under his command. And then a second regiment came through, and it was more peacefully done. But then General Butler, basically, he kept Maryland in the Union through some very, strong, no-nonsense approach to making sure that Baltimore stayed in the Union, and he didn't let it get loose. So if join the Confederacy, which would have been a disaster, especially since the capital of the United States was in Washington. So he did a very good job of keeping Maryland from succeeding, although it's not sure it would have in any case, but he made sure it didn't happen. And then he was posted down to Fort Monroe, which he basically got into shape, and then Negroes started coming into Fort Monroe, and he set up a policy of treating the Negroes as contrabands of war. In other words, Southern property that was aiding and abetting the Confederacy, so he basically confiscated them. And after Fort Monroe, he went down to New Orleans. Although it was largely captured by the Union Navy, he was the Army component, and he basically acted as military governor of New Orleans. And he had very draconian policies regarding the rebels, the Confederacy, and made sure that the New Orleans stayed in the Union. And eventually his policies were so controversial that he was relieved. New Orleans was the biggest city in the South, and there were a lot of foreign embassies there, and he was basically spending a lot of time, he had some policies that angered the foreign embassies, and so eventually Lincoln had to recall him. And then he was basically didn't do anything for a couple of years, and then he came back, was put back in charge at Fort Monroe, created the Army of the James, and when Grant engineered his campaign for the spring of 1864, the goal was to do a multi-pronged attack on the Confederacy, and Butler's plan was to come up the James River and attack Richmond and take Richmond as Grant came over from the north over the famous Overland Campaign. He did not take Petersburg or Richmond, and although his movement was a big surprise to the Confederacy, he moved very tentatively, basically sent some reconnaissance forces out, feeling out the Confederacy, instead of just doing an all-in effort. And eventually he was stopped and basically put in a trench line between the James River and Appomattox River basically they said he was bottled up. Well, that's what Grant said. The truth was he wasn't really bottled up, but he had a very strong defensive position, and the Confederates had an equally strong defensive position across from him, and they both sent reinforcements to Grant and Lee over in the Overland Campaign. But it was considered a failure that he wasn't able to take Richmond. We can talk more about this later. Then in the December of 1864, he was part of a joint Navy-Army attack on Fort Fisher, where he used basically a fire ship, or an explosive ship. A ship loaded with explosive that was supposed to damage the fort, and then he would take the fort. Well, he went down there, the ship exploded, didn't do much damage, and he returned back to Virginia, which was not his orders. His orders were to stay there even if he couldn't take the fort. And then his other big effort was the Dutch Gap Canal. Basically, the James River did a big loop, and the Confederates held basically the end of the loop with a very strong fort, and his plan was to cut a canal across the loop and bypass the Confederate fort and get to Richmond that way. And that also never really amounted to anything. It was completed basically after Richmond was taken. So Butler had a very mixed reputation. After the failure of Fort Fisher, he was actually relieved of command of the Army of the James. and he went into a long career after the war in politics and law, and basically practicing law and politics. Um, so for the purpose of this argument, I want to compare his battles that he had, that he was in command of in the Bermuda 100, Bermuda 100, and Petersburg campaigns, and compare the size of his forces versus the enemy forces, and basically the losses on each side, and kind of make a little point here that might shed some more light on Benjamin Butler and what kind of commander he was. So for each of these battles, I'm going to document who the federal commander was, compare the opposing force sizes where I can get that. And I just got this data off Wikipedia. I didn't do anything serious searches, but I figured that would at least I'd have a consistent source of information, even if it's subject to error, as Wikipedia often is. And I would compare the opposing forces' losses. And once again, this is what I would get off the Wikipedia page. So, in the Bermuda 100 campaign, where Butler commanded the forces on the Union side, and basically Beauregard and several other Confederate generals were involved in the Confederate defense here, and this is the area where he failed, and then ended up entrenched in basically in a bottle strongly corked, as the adage says. Basically, there were about 5 significant battles in this campaign, and we have the number engaged and losses on each side. And then following the Bermuda 100 campaign, Grant moved his forces in a famous move over the James River and kind of joined Butler in essence. I mean, Butler was already there, but Grant came down and basically started the siege of Petersburg. And there were a number of battles here, 3 of which Butler had a significant role as commander. Several I couldn't find on the size of the forces or the losses on Wikipedia, so these I'll omit in terms of calculating forces and losses. But there's a number of battles here. They say there was like 9 campaigns in the Battle of Siege of Petersburg. Well, actually, there was more battles than that, although several of these battles went on at the same time, so they were part of one offensive. So I did basically I summed up the forces and averaged them, basically taking the total number of forces divided by the number of battles. And I come up with Union forces averaged 23,000 troops in these battles and had 2,600 losses for an 11% loss rate. Confederates averaged 12,288 troops and suffered 1,591 losses for an average of 12.94% loss. So what we have is the Union typically had a 1.9 to 1 numerical advantage, but they suffered, they inflicted 0.6 losses for every one of their own. That's on all these battles. So if you look at Butler, his average force was 12,857 in these battles. He fought, of all of them, the ones that Butler was in a commander in, he had 12,857 men. He suffered 1,301 losses for a 10 5.12% loss rate. His opponents had 8,457 men and suffered 898 losses for a 10.62% loss rate. And so his force ratio, instead of like 1.9 to 1, was only 1.5 to 1. So actually he outnumbered the enemy less than in these other battles. Now, keep in mind, Butler didn't engage. He left troops behind. Of course, if you look at the situation where he was on Bermuda 100, he was like 50, 60 miles from the sea. He had to protect a long supply line. Although the Navy did a lot of the protecting and patrolling of the river, that was their supply line, the river. Still, the Confederates would occupy the shore. They couldn't afford to let the Confederates, build a major fort on the shore and occupy it and block their supply line. So they had a rather tenuous, vulnerable supply line up the James River, and he had to put substantial forces into making sure that supply line wasn't severed, or he'd been in real trouble. By the time Grant got there with the Army of the Potomac, that supply line was already secured by Butler's troops, so Grant could just move ahead. He had a secure supply line. I don't think people give Butler enough credit for occupying basically Bermuda 100 deep in enemy lines, very close to the center of the enemy home. Basically Richmond and Petersburg, basically very close. I don't think they give enough credit for him, what he did with about 32,000 people. Where McClellan got close to Richmond too, but he got pushed back, and he had like 124 times as many men, although, he was facing the brunt of the Confederate forces. But I don't think people give Butler enough credit for getting deep into enemy territory and holding that base essentially in the midst of enemy territory. It's not really recognized how, if you look at the trench lines the Union constructed during the siege of Petersburg, they're actually two-sided. They have one side of the trench lines facing Petersburg, and they have another set of trench lines facing behind them, because they were afraid of getting attacked in the rear by raiding Confederate forces. So in essence, it was a siege within the siege. The Union Army was under siege at the same time the Confederate Army, and I don't think this is recognized at all, or very seldom. So anyway, getting back to these numbers thing. So Butler had a force ratio of 1.5 to 1, and inflicted versus suffered losses is 0.7. So he had a lower preponderance of force over the enemy, but he inflicted a greater proportional casualties than the overall. And then if you look at the battles that did not involve Butler, there were bigger battles, 30,000 Union troops with 3,500 casualties and 11.7% loss versus 14,700 Confederate troops on average with 2,000 casualties, 13.8% loss. So what's clear here is, although Butler had lower odds, he also was not as aggressive, and he did not push he was more careful with his troops. He did not risk his troops as much, and it's clear if you read about the Bermuda 100 campaign. He was very cautious, sending out what in essence were reconnaissance forces before finally sending his whole army up. But the not Butler, they had over a 2-to-1, 2.1 to 1 force ratio, and they still inflicted less casualties than Butler. So you could make a case that Butler did very well with what he had. He had not as great preponderance of force, and he inflicted more casualties. Now, I think on the flip side is he did not have this aggressive killer instinct, and he was more interested in basically defeating them and saving his own troops. So just to compare some other efforts at the same time, we talked about the Peninsular Campaign under McClellan having a great number of troops and not achieving really any more than Butler did. We can compare the Red River Campaign under Banks, which happened also in the spring of 1864, where Banks' army almost got, that was near disaster, that Red River Campaign. So I think it's important to remember that there was basically a lot of challenges in going deep into enemy territory, and things could have turned out far worse for Butler than they did. Hold on a second. Okay. And just to talk about going deep in enemy territory, Sheridan made an effort to capture Richmond in May 1864. He didn't get that. I mean, he got fairly close, but he decided it wouldn't be worth the cost and turned back. Even aggressive Sheridan understood the risk of penetrating deep into enemy territory. We've talked a little bit about Butler's canal project. Well, Grant had a canal project too, trying to bypass Vicksburg, which eventually he gave up on, and was pretty much a very expensive failure. So people complain about Butler's Dutch Gap Canal, but there was a preceding effort Grant made to make a canal, very similar canal at Vicksburg, and which also failed to do anything. We talked about the Fort Fisher expedition, which failed after he took a ship and exploded it as close to the fort as he could make it, which did nothing. One thing people got to consider before that happened. There was an explosion of an ammunition barge at City Point, which was the Union Army's base, on August 9th, 1864. And this barge caused a lot of damage, killed a lot of people. And I'm just wondering, I have no documentation, this is just speculation, but I'm wondering if this explosion of this barge inspired Butler in terms of trying to explode a ship near the fort. But anyway, this kind of goes along with Butler's trying to save lives. I mean, it seems to me, and the guy personally was fearless. Basically, he had a price tag on his head when he occupied New Orleans. Jeff Davis actually put a bounty on his head. But he would ride around New Orleans in an open carriage. Personally, he was fearless, but he tried to take care of his troops. And then I mentioned before about the occupation of Bermuda 100 and City Point. made Grant's surprise crossing of the James possible. This is something that people always talk about Grant's surprise crossing of the James and how he caught Lee completely off guard. Well, the thing you got to remember is that supply line along the James River was already established. So although it seems like a great move, and it was in terms of him surprising Lee, the reality is Grant had it seemed like an operationally straightforward move because they already had the supply line, they had troops there, they had a supply base there. It shouldn't have been such a surprise to Lee that he would want to join forces. So anyway, so one other thing I wanted to summarize. Butler rarely got involved in the front lines of combat. Well, he never did, actually. There was a fight. The Confederates tried to take New Orleans back, and there was a fight outside New Orleans. He wasn't there. There was a fight outside of, I believe it was Norfolk or Fort Monroe. He was not there. And then a lot of the fighting on Bermuda Hundred he had delegated to his corps commanders, Gilmore and Smith, who did a lot of the fighting. Once again, he minimized casualties. He tended to avoid risky frontal attacks on unknown or strong defenses. And this was, to some extent, his downfall with Grant, is when he got to Fort Fisher and he didn't attack because he looked at this impressive defensive fortification. He just decided it wasn't worth doing and came back. So that was kind of his downfall. In the end, if you look at the Union commanders that ended up finishing the war, basically, Sheridan, Grant, Sherman, and Thomas, they were all in the end would be willing to take on fortified positions, something Butler just couldn't do. But the other thing on the positive side, he didn't cede captured territory to the enemy if it was defensible. I mean, he was very much a patriot and wanted to defeat the South, occupy the South, reunite the Union. So if it looked feasible, he would hold on to captured territory. I mean, if you, and it meant something. So that's, he held on to Bermuda Hundred. And the Confederates did make an attack on his defenses at one point, which was stopped. But this cautious strategy resulted in the fact that he never suffered a complete defeat. I mean, he was defeated in his campaign in the Bermuda Hundred to take Richmond or Petersburg, whichever he was designed to take. I think it was supposed to be Richmond. But his army wasn't defeated in a way that they were routed from the field. And on the flip side, he never won a complete victory. So he had a very cautious approach. He apparently valued human life more than some other commanders. More than and he thought it was more important, apparently, than getting this great victory. In summary, he could never be considered a top-ranked battlefield commander. I mean, because of this lack of aggressiveness. But on the other hand, maybe he wasn't as incompetent as he's often portrayed. It just, he didn't have this killer instinct. But he never suffered this major defeat on the flip side. I mean, and I think in all, he definitely he wasn't the top guy, but maybe he wasn't as incompetent as he's made out to be. He had a very dominant, strong personality. If you read one of his biographies, he's a very strong, stubborn person, and I think his values of maintaining his army intact without excessive losses probably hindered his ability to defeat the enemy. But also, I think he was given some difficult challenges, and for the most part, he did as well as other people did in similar situations, except for a couple of the top Union commanders. So that's kind of my different point of view. Certainly welcome in the comments if you have a different point of view. But I just think this guy is such a controversial character. He's so hard to understand. If you read about in his biography, his politics, his use of Negro soldiers and his support of Negro soldiers, and just basically his fighting for the rights of these black men after the war. It's just a very interesting character. He's somebody that never gave in to the Southern idea of the lost cause and the Jim Crow laws and all that. He was always fighting for the black man, whereas many Northerners basically got war weary or tired of the situation and decided it was time to move on. And they let the South rule itself and kind of reconstitute a near slave society. So this is I'm sure this is a controversial idea, but I just had to throw it out there as something to consider. And thank you, and have a great day.